Right, I think we'll yes, we'll get going because we're already 4 minutes after the hour. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Clean Arctic Alliance's Pre-MEPC 77 briefing. I'm Sian Prior. I'm the lead advisor with the Clean Arctic Alliance, a coalition of 21 non-profit organizations campaigning to reduce the impact of shipping on the Arctic. Could I please just address a couple of housekeeping points to start off with? We are using meeting mode, so could you please make sure that your microphones are muted? We will have plenty of time for questions. You're very welcome to put questions in the chat at any point, and then we'll have a Q&A session once we've... Also, can I just remind everybody that we are recording this, so just so that you know that. The International Maritime Organization's Marine Environment Protection Committee, MEPC 77, commences on Monday next week, hot on the heels of COP26. It has a prime opportunity to agree to the first international commitments and action post more than 1.5 degrees C warming. We're going to have three short speeches now. First of all, we're going to hear from Dr. Lucy Gilliam from Seas at Risk, who has recently returned from COP26, and she is going to brief us on the main messages from the COP and what these mean for MEPC. Then we'll turn to John Maggs, President of the Clean Shipping Coalition, who will say a few words about expectations for the outcome of MEPC 77 on greenhouse gas emissions from shipping. And finally, I will say a few words on our aspirations for strong outcomes to address black carbon emissions from ships. The floor will then be yours for questions once we've finished the interventions. We'll move straight on to our first speaker with no further, we'll move straight from speaker to speaker with no introductions, and I'll hand over now to you, Lucy, to take over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sian, and thank you very much, everyone, for attending today. As Sian said, I've just got back from 2 weeks at COP, a very intense time with a lot going on, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of public momentum outside the COP, as well as interesting discussions inside. Now, one of the first things that I want to say about the COP is just how much attention there was on the 2030 climate goals and this idea of keeping the 1.5 degree goal alive rather than 2 degrees. So I think that this is really a take-home message that 2030 is incredibly important, and 1.5. One of the first main things that I noticed at COP was the declaration, the Dakar-Glasgow Declaration from the Climate Vulnerable Forum of Countries. 54 countries were in that declaration, 47 of which are IMO member states. And it includes a segment on maritime supporting a greenhouse gas levy, i.e. a carbon price, to align shipping emissions with the 1.5 degree pathway at IMO. So that's the first take home. Second take home, I noticed from attending events, was just how extreme the change is in the Arctic. Now, I attended various events at the Cryosphere Pavilion and also the Inuit Day, which was on the 7th of November, slap bang in the middle of COP. And it is clear that the environment there is changing rapidly with all sorts of consequences. So, you know, the need for action is absolutely, you know, desperate. The 1.5 degree pathway, according to IPCC, requires us to make at least a 45% reduction in global emissions by 2030 and to reach zero emissions overall by 2050. So we must act with urgency, and we must listen to those communities that are being affected. And I saw a number of those, both inside the blue zone and also protesting outside. The final thing that was loud and clear at the COP was, although loss and damage wasn't agreed, it is clear that this, along with just transition, is something that must be tackled. This debate will not go away. So I hope that we can take this message of the need of loss and damage and just transition to us, with us to the IMO next week. The second big takeaway was that shipping was visible at COP26, more so than at any other COP that I've been to. And I think that this attention on shipping means that we really must now deliver at MEPC 77. Some examples of this were many shipping conferences that were happening outside the Blue Zone at COP. There was a zero emission shipping conference that was the first 3 days. There was an ICS conference in the middle of COP, and many tech showcases all across the inside and outside venues, including some excellent presentations on what's going on regionally in the IMO MTCC, the Maritime Technology Capacity Building Centres. Also, what was loud and clear coming from people attending these workshops was that IMO policy needs to catch up and support those that want to move now. An example of this is the Clydebank Declaration, which 22 countries signed to create green corridors for zero carbon shipping by 2025 and to make these shipping routes commercially viable. To do this, we'll need a significant carbon price in order to bridge the gap between the clean and dirty fuels and to ensure that we get immediate uptake of zero carbon fuels. So, however, one of the things that is noted from the Clydebank Declaration was that it was watered down at the last minute with a lack of governance and lack of certainty. So we do need to go further and make sure that there is policy to be able to support these declarations. Second big announcement was the declaration on zero emission shipping by 2050. Now, 14 countries signed up to this. They were Belgium, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Honduras, Hungary, Iceland, Marshall Islands, Norway, Panama, Sweden, UK, and USA. So we're hoping that these countries will also be bringing this message directly into MEPC next week with greater ambition. Final takeaway specifically on shipping at COP was the need for regional policy to go alongside global policy and the need to be including shipping in NDCs for transparency and to make these sums on energy and shipping add up, to make sure that the rich nations own shipping emissions and move first to reduce emissions and to contribute towards climate justice. Okay, third thing, my third big takeaway from COP is that there is still a lack of short-term action and commitment on the table. So while there's been a lot of positive things that happened at COP, we're not seeing measures on the table that would deliver in the 2020s up to the 2030 timeframe. Now, if we look at the current IMO measures on the table, we will likely see emissions grow unless there are further measures proposed. And the carbon budget will be used up by 2029 at current rate. Now, John will be saying a little bit more about this. So my final message to leave on is really echoing the message from Antonio Guterres, the UN chief, in his final sum up of COP26. COP26 is an important step, but it is not enough. We must accelerate climate action to keep the goal of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And what I'll say is that means the International Maritime Organization must too. So I will now hand over to John Maggs, the Clean Shipping Coalition President, to say more specifically about what we're calling for at MEPC 77.
Hello, and thank you very much, Lucy, for that. I'm going to say a few words about expectations for MEPC 77. This is, we don't know what's going to happen there. We know what the agenda looks like, but I think one of the defining features of the situation at the IMO at the moment is that there's something of a mismatch between the scale of the climate crisis and how that's represented at the COP and in a lot of the activities inside the COP, but also outside. There is huge public and international concern about the climate crisis. There's also an understanding about 1.5 and the fact that the next 10 years are critical. But one thing that's very, very noticeable for anybody who's following the developments at the IMO is that there seems to be a mismatch between the agenda of the IMO and the scale of the climate crisis. When we should be agreeing to cut emissions deeply in the short term, the IMO is discussing mid and long-term measures that in their currently envisaged form will likely only deliver significant emission reductions in the 2030s. And I've got, while talking, I've asked Clean Arctic Alliance to put this slide up because I think it speaks more eloquently than anything about the scale of the task and the gap between what the IMO is currently doing and what has to happen to keep warming below the 1.5 degrees. So there is an urgent need for the IMO to refocus on the next 10 years and what's needed in those 10 years in order to protect the target of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees. And I think, this is what we hope from the meeting. But I think there are two things need to change. The first one is the mid and long-term discussions. Now, some of you will know at least that the IMO has previously discussed short-term measures. It's currently discussing what it calls mid and long-term measures. But the danger with the mid and long-term measures is that they're only going to deliver emission reductions post-2030. So the first thing that needs to happen at IMO is that the mid and long-term discussions need to refocus on the pre-2030 period and make sure that whatever they're agreed in the mid and long-term discussions deliver cuts in the 2020s. Now, that's not that they won't deliver cuts in the 2030s as well, but we have to start this work in the 2030s. And as you'll see from the graph, what a strict 1.5 degree compatible emissions pathway means for international shipping is actually a 50% cut in absolute emissions by 2030. So we need the mid and long term process to wrap up quickly with substantial and ambitious measures if it's to contribute to the pre-2030 period. The second thing, and this of course is not on the agenda at the IMO, but it's what should happen at the IMO and what we would hope would happen, is that the short-term measure should be revisited. Now, its ambition is, even though the short-term measure, which the IMO discussions on this have effectively concluded, that measure was supposed to be, the way in which the IMO delivered urgent short-term emission reductions. And of course, the level of ambition that got attached to that short-term measure was essentially business as usual. Indeed, it wasn't they've agreed targets out to 2026, but they're not even enough to bend the curve down. So, there needs to be an urgent revisiting of the short-term measure and the levels of ambition attached to it. I mean, the carbon intensity indicator tool could be used to deliver ship decarbonisation quickly, but it has to have an ambitious target. At the moment, the IMO is envisaging not returning to the levels of ambition until 2026. And of course, at COP26, it was agreed that levels of ambition would be revisited and looked at every year. And I think this same approach has to happen for the IMO. It's not there at the moment. They're imagining only looking again at the short-term measure levels of ambition in 2026, and that's far too late. We need to do that immediately. So that's what needs to happen, in respect of emission cuts before 2030. I'd like to say a couple of other things, just quickly about zero by 2050 and the levy proposal that's on the table at IMO. There's a lot of interest in zero by 2050. There's a resolution brought forward by the Pacific states that will be on the table at MEPC 77. At the moment, you'll remember that the IMO has a target of an at least 50% reduction by 2050. Despite the rhetoric, this isn't compatible with 1.5 degrees, and it's not compatible with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So that needs to change. Fortunately, we've got a resolution proposal for 6. We've also got a proposal from the US and some other countries suggesting that we very quickly revise the levels of ambition in the initial greenhouse gas strategy, and that we move in essence to a zero by 2050 target. And of course, we're very, very supportive of this. But there are 3 things on this subject I'd like to say. The first one is that actually, as you can see in that graph, you know, the 1.5 degree trajectory is really 0 by 2040, certainly closer to 2040 than to 2050. So that needs to be borne in mind. And the second is that, of course, you know, and this ties to my first point, is that as the United States suggests in their paper, it's no good having just a decarbonisation objective for 2050. You've got to have something in the shorter term as well. So we need an absolute emission reduction target for 2030. And of course, as you can see from the graph that you're looking at, and from what I've said already, you know, we believe that this needs to be a 50% cut by 2030. The last thing on this point is just to say that, you know, 0 really should mean 0. I mean, you will probably have read about, maybe you've seen the papers, but not everybody is talking about plain old 0. And I think we need to be very, very careful when looking at proposals from some elements, particularly within industry, that this should be net 0. And it shouldn't be all climate impacts, it should just be CO2. You know, these are going to let polluters off the hook, and they're only going to tackle part of the problem. I mean, for example, having a CO2 only goal would mean that we weren't going after black carbon, which, you know, on a 20-year time frame is over 20% of shipping's climate impact. I'm obviously taking a little bit longer than I should have done. Apologies for that. But my final point relates to the just transition that Lucy talked about in her comments. This, of course, was you know, loss and damage, just transition, very, very high up the agenda at COP. You know, it's clearly a quid pro quo. Those who've done least to bring about climate change but are suffering most need help through transition. And you know, the IMO is one place, and shipping is one industry that can provide that help. You know, there are some. Well, you know, I'm not even. I mean, there are industry proposals on the table which I think are, you know, are too weak and do not take this issue seriously. But we have a very well developed proposal from the Pacific Small Island states with a start price of $100 a ton of carbon for ship emissions. Now, you know, at that level, this is only going to make modest inroads into emissions. So this is not the tool to bring emissions down steeply in the short term, but it is a way of raising funds and providing resources in order to make sure that the transition within the industry and outside of it is a just one, and that, you know, those, as I say, those who contributed least to climate change but are suffering most, you know, are compensated and are allowed and helped to transition their own maritime industries. So, you know, the levy, it's an important part of the puzzle, but it's, you know, it's only one part. And I think, you know, I would say, you know, it's going to end up having to be a part of a bundle of measures where other measures are targeting the emission reductions. I'll stop there. This has all been about greenhouse gases, really, and now I'm going to hand over to Sian, who's going to talk about black carbon.
Thank you, John. And yes, I was going to start off by saying, of course, although carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases are the biggest part of the problem when it comes to shipping, 1/5 of the CO2 equivalent emissions from shipping are from black carbon, at least on a 20-year warming potential. It's over a decade now since 3 IMO members submitted a proposal to the Marine Environment Protection Committee proposing action to reduce the impact of black carbon emissions on the Arctic. The IMO members have spent the last 11 years now considering how to define black carbon, how to measure black carbon, and fairly recently they identified a very long list of measures which could reduce black carbon emissions, but currently there are no commitments or absolute limitations on the amounts of black carbon that can be emitted by shipping. You probably know, but black carbon is a short-lived climate pollutant. It has a particularly devastating impact when it's emitted in or near to the Arctic. It adds to the warming in the atmosphere, and it speeds up the melt of snow and ice. And as the snow and ice melt, the dark surfaces of land and water that are revealed result in even more heat being absorbed and further warming and therefore further melting of the ice and snow. It's now anticipated that we might see the first summer days with no Arctic sea ice as early as the 2030s. and certainly by 2050. At MEPC 77 next week, there is an opportunity for the IMO to adopt its first ever measure to restrict black carbon emissions from shipping in and near the Arctic. It's a proposal for a resolution urging member states and ship operators has been submitted by 11 countries. And although voluntary, it could really lead to a clear message to the industry, the direction of travel, and that action is urgently needed. The resolution calls on member states and ship operators to voluntarily use distillate of low aromaticity or other cleaner alternative fuels or methods of propulsion that have been shown to reduce black carbon emissions from ships when operating in or near the Arctic. As I said, it's been submitted by 11 countries, 11 IMO members: Canada, Finland, France, Germany, Iceland, the Netherlands, Norway, the Solomon Islands, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States. We feel that it's absolutely vital that this is agreed at MEPC 77 next week. As I say, it'll be the first step taken towards addressing short-lived climate forces, which make up around a fifth of ships' CO2 equivalents. And it's a quick and simple change that can be put in place very quickly. And it will make a big difference this decade. I think that's what's really important, that because black carbon is short-lived, it spends days or at the maximum weeks in the atmosphere. If you eliminate your black carbon emissions or reduce them, you see that the positive benefits very quickly as well. There is no need for any new technology or any new infrastructure to make this change. It is simply about choosing a better fuel, a fuel that will produce, when it's burnt by ships, will produce less black carbon. The other thing on the agenda, just for completeness sake, really, proposed terms of reference for further work on black carbon. These need to be agreed. It's vital that this work goes ahead. And I think alongside agreeing that the terms of reference for the further work that needs to be done to address black carbon globally is a need for an expression of the urgency with which this work must take place. It's imperative now that this work goes ahead, but quickly, that we don't take another decade trying to decide what other measures are required to reduce black carbon emissions. The Arctic doesn't have another decade. So that's it in terms of black carbon and me. We'll move now to, that summarizes what we're certainly hoping to achieve next week. We'll move now to some questions. We've got around 20 minutes for questions. We've got plenty of time. I see that there's at least one question already in the in the chat function. Please, if anyone else has questions, pop them into the chat function. And Paul, are you happy, Paul Gunton, are you happy to turn on your camera, or at least turn on your microphone and just state your question?
Yes, that's me. Yeah, out of COP26, we hear a lot about what organisations like the IMO should be doing, and my question was, what should individual ship owners and operators do in response to COP26?
Lucy, go ahead.
Okay, well, I saw your question come in, Paul, and so I had a little think about it, and I think there's maybe 3 things that might be possible. I think the top one, given that Sian's just made her intervention, would be for ship owners and operators to commit to a distillate switch and to stop using heavy fuel oil, particularly if they are operating in or near the Arctic. However, I would say that any ship that is operating, north of the Mediterranean Sea will still be producing black carbon emissions that end up contributing towards black carbon deposits on the poles. So that would be the first thing, switch to these cleaner fuels. Secondly, I think looking at deploying all of the kind of clean technology and efficiency options that are available now. So there's various things like various wind technologies that are now available for ship owners to reduce the amount of fuel that they're burning. There are various technologies for either retrofits and new builds. So look into that. A big conversation at COP was about finance, and how do you get the finance in place in order to enable ship owners to build these new ships or to be able to invest in what's needed for the retrofit. So hopefully some of the past barriers are beginning to sort of unlock and enable ship owners and operators to be able to proceed with those technologies. And then finally, I think the really big one is support ambitious policy in order for there to be a level playing field so that everybody can really do the best they can and to be ambitious as is possible. And for that, we need good, clear rules and a target, and this appreciation for the need for action right now in this decade. So that would be my top 3 things. And I'll hand over to John. I think he wants to come in as well on that question.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got it. I mean, no, you nailed it, Lucy. That was brilliant. You know, there was just one, one little twist to this, I think, and that is that, actually the way that you can bring ship emissions down, quickly, steepest, is by slowing down. And of course, the industry has already done this to some extent during the, as a result of the recession and overcapacity in the fleet. But we've seen the first signs of speed starting to creep back up again. So, but at the same time, you can't really, and this is Lucy's point, or last point, I think, that actually what we need is a regulatory, well, more than a signal, we need the IMO to signal that, that fossil fuels will be history for shipping, in, well, ideally 2040, maybe 2050. So we need a much, much stronger signal, but there also needs to be a regulatory framework for this. And, I mentioned when I was talking earlier about the carbon intensity indicator. Now, when they agreed that at IMO, I mean, this is something that ships will have to abide by. They'll have to improve their carbon intensity year on year. When that was negotiated and agreed quite recently, they settled on an improvement in the carbon intensity of ships, a percentage improvement annually that was no different to what was happening spontaneously, just as a result of creeping efficiency improvements. They basically chose a percentage that was business as usual. If they'd wanted to bring emissions down steeply in line with 1.5 target, they would have to have chosen a 6 to 7% annual improvement in the carbon intensity of ships. And if they'd done that, a whole load of things would have happened. All the shipping industry, every ship would have gone after all sorts of interesting new technologies. They'd have started using sails. They'd have slowed down for sure. And they'd have done it because they had to do it, and they'd know that every other ship operator was doing the same thing, so it would be, fair. It would be that, the level playing field of well, that is often mythical, but that everybody seems to be very, very supportive of. So, I think it's, it's, of course they can do stuff themselves, but I think it's unfair really to expect them to do it in a vacuum. There needs to be very, very clear regulatory instructions from on high, and that's where the IMO, that's why the IMO is so important.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please feel free to put questions, and I see there's a couple more in the chat, or to raise your hand as well. It's another way of indicating you'd like to ask a question. Baz Hensing, would you like to ask your question? Though I see actually that it's been responded to in the chat as well, but would you like to ask it, and then we can we'll give a fuller response.
Yeah, my question related to the advice to slow down, and I asked if it's as effective for BC, for black carbon, as it is for CO2 reduction, because I have another feeling, but there was already a response in the chat. But what is your opinion, John, or Sean, or?
Well, I'll happily start off. As I say, that there's a couple of responses in the chat, I think both of which are accurate, so no problem with that. I think the problem with black carbon is that there are very many variables, and there's certainly speed does make a difference to emissions. At low speeds and at high speeds, black carbon emissions tend to go up, but it does also depend on the engine optimization as well. So unfortunately, it's not a straightforward question when it comes to black carbon. John, I think I see you wanting to come in.
Well, no, I think Lucy in the chat has got it there. I mean, yes, when your engine operates outside of its optimal performance point, then you can see black carbon emissions increase. But the thing is that you're also getting a much reduced fuel burn because you're going slower. So the BC emissions from that fall. So for most for the range that we're talking about, because we're not talking about ships going around at 2 or 3 knots. For the range that we're talking about, there is always a net benefit. Well, in most cases, a net benefit for black carbon as well. Although, it's good that you asked the question, because it's not quite as straightforward as CO2. But it's not it's in most situations it's a no regret policy.
Thank you. Any other questions? Simon, I can see you've made a couple of comments in the chat about a press statement and writing an article. In fact, we're going to be issuing, or at least we're part of a coalition or group putting out a press statement that will go out tomorrow about the outcomes of COP and what that means for MEPC and for the IMO. So we'll make sure you get hold of that tomorrow. And then, yes, we'll be issuing statements next week as we usually do at the beginning and the end of MEPC. So we can make sure that those are available to everybody. If you're not on our regular mailing list to receive our press briefings, just let us know and we can make sure that everyone receives it.
Good, thanks. I mean, I was just thinking that it's better to have the information firsthand, but from out from the other articles or newsletters or whatever. But then again, yeah, you answered that question. Thank you.
Thank you. And Paul, I see you've added more in the chat as well. John, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, more than happy. Paul, you're on my, if you hadn't guessed it already, you're on my favourite subject, and we have done an awful lot of work, digging down, mining, the details of what happens when you slow ships down. And of course, you're absolutely right. You need more ships. But it doesn't. But all the extra ships do is erode away some of the benefit. And at the end of the day, after you've built more ships, operated more ships, fueled more ships, you still get an almost 2-to-1 benefit from slower speeds. So yeah, I mean it's something that well, I mean if you want more detail, there are lots of reports on this subject and we'd be more than happy to share them with you, but yes, it's if you just at an individual ship level you get almost a 30% reduction in emissions for a 10% reduction in speed. That turns into something like 19% once you've taken into account additional ships needed to carry, obviously, to do the same amount of transport work.
Thank you, John. Any more questions? I'm hoping I've not missed any in the chat, just trying to keep an eye on that as well. If anyone would like to ask a question, please feel free to stick your hand up as well. Last chance for any further questions. John, Lucy, any further comments you would like to make, or any just responding to anything that's been said?
Well, I suppose, I mean, and this is connected to the speed issue. And the mismatch that I tried to describe, earlier between the scale of the climate emergency, which I think was, came across very, very strongly from COP26. But the scale of that climate emergency doesn't come across strongly at an average IMO meeting. It's a much more, if you'll forgive the phrase, it's a much more complacent environment, and that's exactly what has to change. It's in the next 10 years are critical for 1.5 degrees. So what happens on shipping in the next 10 years is absolutely the most important thing, and that's where the IMO needs to focus. And as soon as it does that focus, or it achieves that focus, then it has to deal with black carbon emissions, and it has to do everything it can do in the short term to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. And speed is right at the top of the ways that ship operators will bring their emissions down. And of course there'll be lots of other things too, But at the moment, there's no clear signal that they have to do this because there's no urgency at IMO, and that has to change.
Thank you. Ilko, what outcomes do you expect from MEPC and what are you hoping for? Sorry, I've read your question out. Is that okay? Apologies. I mean, for me, for black carbon, you know, we need the resolution. A resolution is, the idea has been bouncing around for a couple of years now. There was a draft one submitted. I think the proposal was first put forward last year and then a draft one submitted earlier this year. The issue didn't even get discussed, unfortunately, because of the time constraints associated with virtual meetings, because of COVID, various things have sort of fallen off the agenda. So next week, I'm hoping that for the first time, we'll get a really robust discussion around a resolution. As I said, the resolution on the table has got 11 countries co-sponsoring it from a wide range of parts of the world, 6 Arctic states, but some European states, some South Pacific states, North America, obviously as part of the Arctic states. So good broad support. This would, to us, is imperative because it really it is the first time the IMO will have actually agreed to an action that will have any relevance to emissions of black carbon. It is voluntary. So it doesn't have the teeth that perhaps we would like, and it's important for us at least that something mandatory should follow pretty quickly. But it gives countries the opportunity to then take action. They can turn it into domestic regulation, or it can be taken forward at a regional level into regulation as well. So it's the first step, and it shows, I think it gives a clear direction of the intention, the direction of travel on the subject as well. But as I say, it's the first step, it's the start of a process with respect to black carbon, and you know, no more than that. John, Lucy, do you want to add something on the carbon dioxide as well and what we'd like to see out of MEPC next week?
Basically, I think we'd like to see that the recognition of the urgency of the need to take climate action, and to proceed very swiftly with support for policies that have been put forward by climate vulnerable countries like the Pacifics, and to see like kind of a reopening of discussions around what can be done in the next decade. So that's like on greenhouse gases. I think to further this question of what do we hope to see at MEPC, one of the things that I hope to see is that this recognition of the need to act in order to protect vulnerable communities. And I just want to say, we were delighted last week to see that the Inuit Circumpolar Council were admitted as observers to the International Maritime Organization. So really, looking forward to them being present in the debate and hopefully supporting this demand for greater climate action from the industry.
3 more questions have popped up. So rather than get people to read them out, because I think time's pushing on, I'll respond to the first one. Lucy, would you be able to respond to the one from Cohen Faber? And then John, maybe to the one from Baz Hensing. And Steph says, thank you for all your support. No problem, Steph. It's been great working with you and really looking forward to working with you in the future. Also, Dave will make sure that everybody is able to see the slides and the recording of this briefing. He'll circulate the information tomorrow. But first of all, Dorte, you asked about the HFO ban in the Arctic and whether that will have an impact in terms of black carbon emissions. Unfortunately, the HFO ban, which was developed to respond to the risk of oil spills, is not really going to do very much in terms of black carbon emissions. Based on the analysis published by the International Council on Clean Transportation, because of the waivers and exemptions that have been included in the regulation, it's likely that when it comes into effect in 2.5 years' time, mid-2024, it will only result in a 5% reduction in black carbon emissions. This is because, as I say, the waivers and exemptions, which mean that the vast majority of shipping using heavy fuel oil in the Arctic will still be able to do so until 2029. And we've lost another decade then. So unfortunately, I don't think the HFO ban is really going to make much difference in terms of black carbon emissions. Lucy, are you able to respond to the question from Cohen Faber?
Yes, a little bit. I think, you know, touched on some of these supply chain issues and port call optimization and what cargo owners want. I think what I would say there is still we need to look at the policy for this level playing field. I think when we've got that ambition and we've got that policy saying that we need to act in that time frame, I think then, you know, finance and contracts will then, you know, get in line, and you'll be able to get, you know, groups of cargo owners, you know, putting conditions into the contracts with the freight forwarders and the shippers that they're using. That's not to say that you just wait for IMO to act. I think there's lots of initiatives that are happening kind of in this space, and you know, there is public pressure also being applied to companies that are using shipping services. You know, public companies are also saying, you know, our customers want zero emission shipping services by 2030, 2040. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to be kind of pressing shipping companies in the industry to say that we want things to be done in the most environmentally and socially sensitive way that is possible now. So encourage all of those initiatives to go ahead, as well as get that ambitious policy on the table at IMO.
Thanks, John. We're nearly out of time, so do you want to just quickly? Thank you.
You know what? Yeah, I can be very quick. Yeah, I think we're talking about two different resolutions here. You know, one is the proposal for a black carbon for voluntary black carbon measures. The other one that Lucy referred to is about, you know, zero by 2050. But you know, if you go back to, I mean, and as you can imagine, as you know, as environmental advocates, we're trying to crunch these numbers all the time. You know, if you trawl through, you know, everybody who's involved in the countries that are involved in IMO negotiations, and you look at what they've said about zero by 2050, there's a majority of states that have spoken and supported zero by 2050. That's pretty clear. So you know, it's not quite the challenge that it might at first seem. It's a big jump for the IMO, because at the moment they've got an at least 50 by 2050 target, which is, you know, woefully inadequate. But, you know, and people haven't been, a lot of these countries haven't been saying zero by 2050 in the IMO, but they have in other places. So I think it's not quite as, yeah, it's not quite as hard a lift for the IMO when it meets next week as it might seem. And, you know, and really when you've got, you know, the whole of Europe, the US, you know, large swathe of the developing world, you know, all saying we've got to do this, and we've got to send the right signal now. I mean, I think if the IMO can't get this one right, then we really are in trouble.
Thank you. I'm afraid our time is up, and we're going to have to conclude. If anyone does have any further questions, you're very welcome to put them to us over the coming days ahead of MEPC. And the details are on the slide now, so feel free to contact us. I'd just like to thank Lucy and John for joining us today, and to thank also those behind the scenes who have made this briefing possible. And also to thank all of you for joining the briefing. It wouldn't work if you hadn't come and joined, and we're really grateful for the questions that you've brought forward as well. I hope that many of you will be joining us at MEPC. I believe some may even be joining in person, but most of us, I suspect, will still be there virtually. And that you will all be able to contribute to this important discussion. Thank you. As I said earlier, the slides and the recording will be circulated tomorrow, and it's been really, really useful. Thank you.